Ryan Reynolds here for, I guess, my 100th Mint commercial. No, don't. No. I mean, honestly, when I started this, I thought I only have to do like 4 of these. I mean, it's unlimited premium wireless for $15 a month. How are there still people paying 2 or 3 times that much? I'm sorry, I shouldn't be victim blaming here. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/save. Whenever you're ready.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
This episode is brought to you by Experian. Are you paying for subscriptions you don't use, but can't find the time or energy to cancel them? Experian could cancel unwanted subscriptions for you, saving you an average of $270 per year. And plenty of time. Download the Experian app. Results will vary. Not all subscriptions are eligible. Savings are not guaranteed. Paid membership with connected payment account required.
Welcome to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. I'm Matthew of castingacross.com, where I explore the quarry and culture of fly fishing. I'm sure you've encountered different types of people that have different perspectives on leaders. There's the guy that has leader formulas that go down to the half inch as far as what the taper should look like, has dozens of types of leaders in a leader wallet, and will change out entire leaders, adding different feet of different X weights of tippet based on the situation. That's one side of the spectrum. The other side, you have the guy that just takes the knotless tapered leader out of the pack and loops it to the end of their fly line and fishes it until it becomes impossible to get that stubby butt section through the eye of their tiny dry fly. Now, I would say both of these perspectives work. I've toyed with both of them. When I started fly fishing, I started using knotless tapered leaders, and I just fished them until I literally couldn't get the thicker section of the leader through the eyes of the trout flies I was using. I've also stressed out about my leaders, trying to figure out precisely how to formulate a taper such to best present my fly, get a drift, etc., etc. So, and I caught fish both ways. So it's not like one is wrong and one is right. I think you could probably spend too much time messing with your leaders if you are on the intricate side of the spectrum, and I think you're going to really miss out on a lot of opportunities to fish better if you're on the more rudimentary side of the spectrum. So I want to talk a little bit about some kind of no-nonsense, simple ways to think about leaders, especially for freshwater fishing in today's podcast. But 2 caveats there. First one is, what is a leader? I get this question a lot from folks that are starting fly fishing and actually folks that have been fishing for a while. Just because if you're coming from a conventional side of things, this might not be as apparent as one might think. So you have your fly line that is the usually braided nylon core surrounded by the PVC, and that's the colorful stuff that's thick, that varies in weight based upon your 4-weight, 5-weight, 6-weight, and so on and so forth. And then what is attached to the end of that is your leader. So that is usually monofilament or fluorocarbon. And it is ideal if there is a taper to it. So your fly line has a taper. We've talked about that in previous podcasts, and there's plenty of resources on the internet to find that kind of information. But you also want a taper that's generally descending. There's a few circumstances where you don't want it necessarily descending, but probably 95% of the situations you're going to be fishing, it is going to be descending from a thicker monofilament or fluorocarbon to a thinner monofilament or fluorocarbon, with the aim being that the energy of your cast carries down this leader, and as it unfurls, it goes from heavier to lighter, and it allows that fly to go out fully and extend and roll out and come down gently, being the first thing that makes contact with the water. There's a lot more science to it than that, but that's what we're talking about when we talk about leaders. It's that bit of monofilament or fluorocarbon, and then of course, if you want to get really technical, there are wire leaders and other materials, but generally you're talking about monofilament or fluorocarbon. It's the clear stuff at the end that goes between your line and your fly. And tippet is just exactly what it sounds like. It's a tip section to add onto that leader. But if you could think of it this way, all tippets are leaders, but not all leaders are tippets, I guess would be the way to say it. But that's probably more confusing than it needs to be. You add tippet onto your leader to make your leader do something special. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So that's the first caveat. What is a leader? The second caveat that I wanted to mention is that I use a lot of furled leaders. Now, not to get too deep into this, but these are braided nylon, so monofilament, or fluorocarbon strands that create usually an unchangeable, so a static. So whereas we're going to talk about leaders later where you snip them and change them and cut them and put knots into them and things like that to achieve different results, a tapered leader is usually a set length, and they're made for different purposes. So there's furled leaders for dry fly fishing, furled leaders for small water, furled leaders for nymphing that have indicator sections in them, furled leaders for saltwater, and they either have a loop-to-loop connection on the end or even tippet rings. My favorite brand that I've used is Appalachian Furled Leader Company. Definitely check them out. Google them. They're all over social media. But this is a caveat if you really kind of prefer to be on the no-nonsense, really simplistic, rudimentary, just take the leader out of the package and fish with it. By using a furled leader, you can almost accomplish that sort of ease, but get the sort of benefits that you get from a more complex leader formula. Because with virtually all the furled leaders I fish a straight piece of tippet off the end of it. So those spools of monofilament or fluorocarbon, a 4, 5, 6 foot stretch of that, just without any fancy knots, either a loop-to-loop to my furled leader or a knot to the tippet ring on my furled leader, and then I fish that straight as is. And I have done that successfully in the salt. I've done it successfully on small brook trout streams and everything in between. So there are pros and cons of using a furled leader, but the pros vastly outweigh the cons. That being said, we'll talk about normal leaders today. So a few things to think about. First of all, you can, as I said before, find some very complex leader formulas. And there's men and women that have been fishing for decades longer than I have that use complex leaders that they tie, not only using different sizes of monofilament. So you're within the freshwater game, we're talking about the X's. So usually you have like a 30 or 20 pound fighting or butt of your leader, and then it goes down, into 0x, 1x, 2x, 3x, 4x, and then, smaller if need be. But they don't just mess with the weight of the monofilament, but they also mess with the rigidity or how supple or flexible it is. So by combining different types of monofilament, different manufacturers have different formulations, so you can actually go from a very, very stiff fly line to a relatively stiff monofilament to a more supple monofilament. There's all sorts of directions you can take this, and they are definitely worth looking into if you want to give it the time, energy, and effort. But for the sake of today, I'm kind of trying to find a medium middle path in between going to that level, if that's just not what you're into, or you just don't have the time for it, or there's other kinds of fishing related miscellany that you'd rather put your thoughts into, then there's an option for you. Additionally, if you are just pulling the lead out of a package and fishing that, I think you can do a little bit better without a whole lot of brain power and a lot of time, and certainly a lot of investment. So that's what we're talking about today, kind of a middle path. But that being said, the first thing I'd say is to start with a knotless tapered leader. If you get a knotless tapered leader, you're going to get some benefits, which is a butt section. So again, that butt section is usually a stiffer, thicker, tapered section of the leader. And those are great because no matter what you're doing, that will be a useful length of monofilament or fluorocarbon. So by having it extruded from thick to thin, you have a knotless, continuous piece of material that goes from, again, that thicker and more rigid to that thinner and more supple. And it's a good foundation for a lot of leader setups that you're able to do. And then I like the fact that they have loop-to-loop connections. I know a lot of guys that snip those things off right away and tie in a brand new nail knot, but I've only had a few of the store made or factory made loop-to-loop connections blow on me. Not enough throughout the years for me to start snipping them off. I still loop them more often than not. And actually what I do is I use that first 6 inches of a knotless tapered leader's butt section to create a monofilament loop at the end of my fly line. So I actually trust a knotless tapered leader's loop that the factory puts in it more than I trust the welded loop at the end of a fly line. So you can buy a fly line that has a loop on the end, which they work, and for trout, I don't really mess around with them too much, but when I'm talking bass, and when I'm talking, either bigger trout or other bigger warm water fish, then what I will usually do is I will take 6 to 8 inches off the butt of a knotless tapered leader, snip it, flip it around, tie a nail knot in with what was the tag end, so that now that store factory made loop is the terminal end of my fly line, if that makes sense. So it goes fly line, nail knot, 6 inches of butt section, and then a loop from the factory. Again, I don't think I've ever blown out one of those knots. I've had the welded loops and nail knots I've tied myself on fly line blowout before I've had those knots blow out that are on the end of a knotless tapered leader. Then I also think that lighter is better generally, which is to say that shorter, more tapered butt sections are better in a wider variety of applications. So I'd start with a base knotless tapered leader of like 9-foot 5X rather than 9-foot 3X. I think that you have a lot more versatility if you have like a 3-foot butt section, that transition from that really stiff to that really supple, if that happens in 3 to 4 feet rather than if it happens over 7 feet more gradually. Get a leader wallet. You can set up 2 or 3 setups. Even if you just want 2 or 3, having a leader wallet is much more efficient than just keeping them coiled in the packages they come in. It makes organization easier. You can also throw other stuff in there, poly leaders, pre-tied tippet sections, all sorts of stuff. You can get them cheap, made out of nylon and plastic, or you can get them fancy, made out of leather and cordura, but get one. And then also the last bit of information is to know your knots. I think one of the reasons why people shy away from messing with leaders is because they don't know how to tie surgeon's loops, which are relatively easy. It's an overhand knot twice, blood knots, and even more complicated knots. But if you can tie a double surgeon's loop and you can tie a blood knot, then you can do all the leader tricks that you'd ever want to do. So get familiar with those. Don't try to mess with it for the first time on a stream. Pulling up how to tie a blood knot on your phone while you're standing, knee deep in water is not the time to figure that out. Do it at home. Do it with thicker fishing line, and then you'll get kind of the hang of it. So that's just kind of some basic tips. Now I want to share some leader formulas. So again, I've mentioned this idea that there's leader formulas out there for every situation and every circumstance, and that's absolutely true. Some of these books from some of the greats that I have downstairs, whether it be Joe Humphreys or Bob Clouser or Lefty Cray or just everybody who's written a book shares a leader formula or a dozen that they really like, and they're worth looking at. But that could be more minutia than you're looking for. If you want some simple formulas, I want to share those very, very briefly today, but because this isn't good radio, this is something to look at, I would really suggest that you head to the show notes of this podcast's page at castingacross.com, and I'll put a link up with some diagrams. Because what I do, and this is really, really simple, is I use a knotless tapered leader as my base, and then instead of just fishing it until I feel like it's kind of gotten to be too short or too thick for my liking, I will, out of the package, make a few cuts and tie on new leader sections. So here's an example. If I want to fish for trout on just a normal trout river, I'll get a 9-foot 5X leader if it's the beginning of the season, and if I'm not fishing one of my furled leaders, get a 9-foot 5X leader out of the package, and I will clip it in half. I will then probably discard the short half. That might seem wasteful, but it's a little bit of monofilament, and you could be wasting a lot more monofilament, I'll put it that way. I'll then tie on 2 feet of 3X and then 3.5 feet of 4X. So we're back to a 9-foot leader because I've got 4.5 feet of butt section, 2 feet of 3X, and 3.5 feet of 4X. But now what I have is knots that show me where my transitions are, that show where I'm going from butt section into 3X into 4X. And this doesn't require precision. A lot of this is not so much feet and inches, this is a full wingspan on me at 5.5 feet tall or whatever I am. Or this is as long as my arm. And you'll kind of start to figure out those patterns for yourself as well. But this is a good general trout leader. And what this does is it shows me I've got 3.5 feet of tippet section of my lightest weight tippet. And as I start getting to within 2 feet of that knot, I might want to retie. And again, you can change these things a little bit. A lot of this has to do with feel. And if you haven't fished hand-tied leaders before, if you've only fished knotless tapered leaders, then you'll start to appreciate kind of those really subtle, delicate hinge points that come even in a gradually tapered leader, and how you can achieve different results, how adding a little bit more length of that tippet, of that smallest X weight tippet, will help your dry flies turn over, or by reducing it will help your dry flies turn over based upon a number of factors, most significantly the size and the wind resistance of the fly. That might sound like a lot, but that's actually a pretty simplified explanation of it. It's above my pay grade to talk about it with any more scientific accuracy than that. So here's an even simpler one. If I'm fishing for bass, or I'm fishing for bluegill, or I'm fishing streamers for trout, I'll get a 7.5 foot 0X leader, and I will cut off about 3 feet of it. So I'm stuck with a 4.5 foot or 5 foot butt section. And then I'll add on 3 feet of 0X. So I have a 0X leader, and then I add 0X onto it. So what this does is it kind of levels it off. And if I'm throwing a very heavy fly like a popper or a conehead streamer, then having that more level line allows me to really kind of kick that fly into the wind, allow it to splash with a little bit of force, especially again if I'm fishing for bass, and having that level, more longer level section, about half of the leader being 0X, is helpful. And then a third kind of formula to introduce would be my dry fly. I'm more persnickety and finicky when it comes to my dry fly leaders than I am with even my more complicated nymph rigs. Reason being is I really want my dry flies to present well. So here's my simple dry fly leader. And again, this is not complicated at all, but it's a 9 foot 5X leader. I save 4 feet of the buck section, then I add 2 feet of 3X, 2 feet of 4X, and 4 feet of 5X. Or you could start with a 9 foot 6X leader and add on 4X, 5X, and then 6X. You kind of get the picture. Again, this isn't great over the podcast, but hopefully you kind of have that picture in your head of what you're doing. You're taking a leader that's smooth, that has no knots in it, and you are breaking it up so that you can control those lengths of the tapers with a certain emphasis on certain parts of that leader. For that dry fly leader, it's that end bit that's nice and long. For that first general purpose one I mentioned, we're talking about something that's very straightforward in its taper, going from equally parts thick to thin and allowing for a very, very basic turnover. You'll figure out what you like as you use this more. You'll probably figure out that tying leaders isn't that difficult, but by using a knotless tapered leader as your base, you're able to start to figure those variables out in a very controlled environment. And using that first 4 feet of butt section, I tell you, it's a lifesaver. It saves you from having to buy all sorts of more expensive and larger spools of line to tie butt sections, and you can just get away with having spools of 0 through 7X if you even feel like you need that much. So again, head over to the website. The show notes will have the information on, actually, I'll put 3 articles up in the show notes. 2 Untying the Mystery of Leader articles, the second of which has the formulas that I mentioned and diagrams of them, and then 1 on fishing furled leaders as well. This week on Casting Across, there was 2 articles that popped up before this one. The first one was called Fly Shop Found. So this is the second piece of a 2-part series on a fly shop that I grew up going to and then just closed its doors mysteriously. So the second part kind of talks about the just some of the observations I made about the community and about my time at that fly shop. And then the second post is called 5 Reasons Why Your Kid Needs His or Her Own Fly Box. And I've said it a million times, I am not an expert fly fisherman. I'm also not an expert parent, but I have figured out how to keep my kids engaged in fly fishing in the outdoors and science and ecology and fly tying throughout the year, and that's to give them their own fly box. So I give you 5 tips on how and why that works in that article. For the recommendation this week, I want to send you to another website. I want you to go to panfishonthefly.com, Panfish on the Fly. Panfish on the Fly is great because it is so focused on doing one thing and doing one thing very well, and that's catching lots of and catching big panfish. So we're talking bluegill, pumpkin seed, sunfish, crappie, even bass, pickerel, all that sort of stuff where it seems so easy to do is to catch a bluegill. But can you catch a big bluegill? Can you catch bluegill with consistency, regardless of weather circumstances and conditions? Panfish on the Fly is a established website that has information for you if you are catching panfish. If you want to up your panfish game, definitely head over there and check them out. They've just introduced a store which has a couple of great fly patterns, as well as a fly tying kit for what I can attest is a killer panfish bug. It's called the triangle bug, and you definitely check that out. So head to panfishonthefly.com or all of the other Panfish on the Fly social media accounts to check them out and see kind of what you've been missing when you could be catching bigger and more panfish. Thanks for listening to the Casting Across Fly Fishing Podcast. Please subscribe in your favorite podcast app and rate the podcast in iTunes. Then head over to castingacross.com where you'll find more info on this podcast and 3 posts a week on the people, places, and things that go into the pursuit of fish.